Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. So this is part one of the presentation for warm-ups for the third cycle of warm-ups for the first quarter. Let me go ahead by first encouraging you to open up the Google Docs template that is on the warm-up post on Google Classroom. And in doing so, please remember that you're to write down the question and the answer that coincides with the question for full credit. Remember, when you're finished with both weeks of warm-ups, please submit them on the post by the deadline specified. Let's begin. The first question today is, what are specific characteristics of different forms of government around the world? Please be specific. So what I'm going to do right now is basically kind of transition between Thursday and Friday's lesson of last week and Monday and Tuesday's lesson of this week to fill you in more about some of the key characteristics that separate certain governments from other governments. Let's get started. The first thing we should keep in mind about governments around the world is the fact that certain governments have different levels of freedom. The most free form of government, where most people can participate in the political process, is democracy. Free societies where people exercise their rights. In democracies, whether they be direct or indirect, people have a chance to get involved in government, whether it be through voting or some other type of political participation. Additionally, there's autocracies that exist in the world. Autocracies are known for being relatively strict governments where power is centralized in a single person. Generally speaking, autocracies can be classified as dictatorships. Also around the world, you have oligarchies, which is where there's rule by a few elite people who have centralized power. Sometimes oligarchies can be comprised of military officials, family officials, or in many different ways, religious officials who are at the top. Also, you have monarchies. Monarchies are where you have royal governments who have and yield power. There are differentiating levels of monarchy. For example, the British government has a monarchy in place, and so do other governments around the world that might have their monarchy having more centralized power than what you might expect. Also, you have theocracies. I alluded to this before with religion, but theocracies are basically religious-backed governments who have power. They basically get their power from religion or religious doctrines, and they implement that through public policies and laws in their respective societies. Let's also not forget about anarchies. Sometimes overlooked, it needs to be talked about in a civics government class because anarchy is where there's no formal body of lawmaking or law enforcement. At the very bottom here, you'll see that there's different factors that tell us and help us see different governments objectively, the level of freedom they have, the distribution of power from certain institutions in government, and the type of rulership that is invoked and practiced. These factors combine to form our understanding of different governments around the world. Let's go to the next question of the day. What major philosophies over time in a democracy combine to form today's government? So in other words, we're going to look at the different things that contributed throughout history to the modern democratic state. So what I'd like to do with you is take you through a brief crash course, so to speak, to brief you on some of the major happenings that have happened to give us American democracy today. Here's the answer. In the beginning, humble origins of family clans that went into communal kingdoms were rather primitive governments. Yes, of course, later on in ancient times in ancient Greece, there was the fierce pure democracy, which involved people voting with rocks. But later on, there were different types of governmental structures that took place. For example, in Europe, there were absolute monarchs who had unyielding amounts of power. The power rested in the hands of a few, powerful kings and queens, and they ruled very, very centralized. Over time, the Enlightenment happened, where different scientific, religious, and political revolutions took place around the world. The Enlightenment philosophers, as we'll refer to them later on in our lesson, were really key in challenging the old ways and means of governance. And many would say that their philosophies and their thoughts put into practice gave us American government. The formation of U.S. government can be traced back to before the 1700s. But for what you're most familiar with is that the founding fathers who created the Constitution blended ideas from different types of philosophers who were from the Enlightenment era to combine to form the United States government as we generally know it today. With lists of rights in our Constitution and the general structure and framework of government, all that can be found during this era. Over time in the United States, modifications and addendums have been made to the Constitution, and the government also transformed as well. If you remember from one of the other lessons that we completed, we talked about how government has changed throughout the years. For example, the federal government has gone a lot bigger. All these changes and events combine to form our understanding of government today. Today we have the modern day democratic nation state with differentiating forms of government that exist around the world. For example, the United States of America has indirect democracy, but we also have a presidential government. Great Britain, our allies overseas, also has a democracy, but they have a parliamentary government where they choose a parliament and that parliament chooses a prime minister. No matter how you look at democracy and government, the fact is that these events have brought about a trip point in world history that give us the modern day democratic state. Thank you very much for tuning in. And remember, part 2 of the presentation and warm-ups are coming your way momentarily. Thanks.